Imagine the biggest World Cup ever put together. 104 matches, 48 national teams, 3 countries, a final on July 19th at MetLife Stadium in New Jersey, an event FIFA itself declared would be the most-watched sporting broadcast in the history of humanity. $30 billion in projected economic impact. A global party. That was the promise. That was the plan. FIFA President Gianni Infantino went out there with that trademark confidence of his and said, out loud, without flinching, that watching the 2026 World Cup would be like living 1,000 years of World Cups compressed into a single event. 1,000 years. He said it just like that, like a man who has spent a decade building towards something and can finally see it about to explode in front of the whole world. And then comes the uncomfortable part. Because as of roughly 3 weeks before the opening whistle, what is actually happening looks nothing like what was sold. 80% of hotels in the United States host cities are reporting reservations below initial projections. And not just a little below. We are talking below the level of a normal summer without any World Cup at all, which means, literally, that in some cities having the World Cup is performing worse for the hospitality industry than not having it. Resale ticket prices are falling across more than 90% of all matches. The opening match for the United States national team, the first time they play at home since 1994, still has tickets sitting unsold above $1,000 just weeks before kickoff. And Newsweek, which is not exactly a tabloid, published an analysis this week describing the biggest sporting event in history with 2 words that genuinely sting when you read them: colossal failure. And it keeps going. Less than 48 hours ago, a group of climate scientists released a study warning that roughly 1/4 of the 104 matches could be played in conditions that exceed the safety limits the Global Players Union considers acceptable. 5 matches, according to those researchers, could be played in conditions where postponement should be seriously considered. And just to top things off, FIFA announced that Madonna, Shakira, BTS, and Chris Martin will perform in the first halftime show in World Cup final history. When the most important match in global soccer, the one that is supposed to be more than enough by itself to fill every expectation, needs Madonna brought in at the break, that tells you something. I am not entirely sure what, exactly, but it definitely tells you something, and here is where it gets genuinely complicated. Because we are not talking about one problem or two. We are talking about a pile-up of simultaneous crises, each one serious on its own, all of them connected to each other in a way that feels deeply unsettling for anyone who loves this sport. They are worth unpacking carefully without easy headlines, because every layer of this story deserves to be understood properly. The first crisis, and the most visible one, is the ticket situation. When FIFA announced it would use dynamic pricing for the first time in World Cup history, the justification was, let us say, commercially logical. The North American entertainment market works that way. Concerts, NBA games, the Super Bowl, everything runs on demand-based pricing. FIFA essentially said, this is how the market we are playing in operates. And then they set the cheapest available tickets for the final at $6,730. Premium packages crossed $10,000. And then, in September of last year, came the cherry on top. Front row seats for the final were listed at $32,970 per ticket. Per person. For one game. That represents an increase of roughly 2,000% compared to the equivalent seats at the Qatar 2022 World Cup. In just 4 years. The reaction was immediate, organized, and probably far stronger than FIFA had anticipated in its models. European fan associations filed a formal complaint with the European Commission accusing FIFA of abusing its monopolistic position. They used the phrase monumental betrayal, those exact words. Members of the United States Congress sent a letter documenting that ticket prices had risen on nearly 90% of matches, averaging a 34% increase over 6 months, and they compared the cost of a front-row seat to the final with 1 full semester of tuition at Rutgers University. That is not a trivial comparison. And then what probably should have appeared earlier in someone's spreadsheet actually happened. The demand that was supposedly justifying those prices simply did not materialize, or at least not in the form FIFA had projected. What did show up were the speculators, bots, people buying tickets as financial instruments to flip on resale platforms, including FIFA's own official resale platform, where the organization collects 15% from the buyer and another 15% from the seller. At the peak, 4 tickets to the final were listed at nearly $2,300,000 each. When a reporter asked FIFA's president about this at a conference in Beverly Hills, he laughed and promised to personally bring a hot dog to anyone who paid that price. The man running a non-profit organization that represents 211 national federations, laughing in a room full of millionaires about what it costs to attend the most important match in soccer. There is something that just feels wrong about that, even if it is hard to articulate precisely. The result of all of this is what the data now shows. Prices falling on more than 90% of matches. The average lowest available ticket price dropped 24% in a single month. Group stage matches at less prominent venues can now be found on the secondary market for around $160, when they were sitting above $600 just back in December. And the deeper problem is that a self-reinforcing cycle has taken hold. Because prices are falling, people expect them to fall further. And because people are waiting, prices keep dropping. Nobody has found the floor yet. The second crisis runs underneath the first one, and in large part, it has been feeding it. The hotel collapse. Fortune magazine published an industry report this week from the American Hotel and Lodging Association, covering all 11 United States host cities: Kansas City, New York, Los Angeles, Boston, Seattle, San Francisco, Houston, Dallas, Miami, Philadelphia, and Atlanta. The results are genuinely unprecedented for an industry that expected the summer of its life. 80% of hotels are reporting reservations below expectations. Many operators describe the booking pace as slower than a normal summer, with no major event. In Kansas City, one of America's most passionate sports cities, home to the Chiefs, proud host of Arrowhead Stadium, somewhere between 85 and 90% of hotels report exactly the same thing. And one phrase has stuck, because the hotel operators themselves used it. Many of them are describing the World Cup as a non-event in their cities. A non-event. For the FIFA World Cup. The reasons are several, and this is where things start tangling into the next layer of the problem. 70% of hotel operators cited visa barriers and general concerns about traveling to the United States as the primary reasons why international demand was not showing up. This is not purely a pricing story. There are tens of millions of people across the world who either cannot obtain the documentation needed to enter the country, or who have looked at publicly available information and made a rational decision that the risk of traveling is too high. That is a very personal calculation. And it is nearly impossible to reverse with a marketing campaign. And then FIFA actively made the hotel problem worse. This part matters because it is not something that simply happened. It is something that was done. In March of this year, FIFA exercised cancellation clauses in its accommodation contracts and returned thousands of hotel rooms across all 16 host cities to the general market. These were rooms that had been block booked for 2 years for officials, press, sponsors, and tournament staff. Hotels had built their entire summer revenue projections around the assumption that those blocks would be filled. When FIFA released them back into the market with little notice, it flooded an already weak demand pool with a sudden oversupply. In some cities, prices fell 40%, almost overnight. The New York Hotel Association told Newsweek they had been expecting 1,200,000 additional international visitors during the competition. What they are actually seeing is maximum 10% year-over-year growth, and nearly half of the city's hotels are reporting zero World Cup-related bookings. $100 million in projected revenue, gone just in New York alone. The third crisis arrived just 2 days ago, and honestly it should concern us most from a purely human standpoint. The heat. The World Weather Attribution Network published its analysis on May 14th. The conclusions are specific and quite alarming. 26 of the 104 matches will likely be played in conditions where the temperature, measured by the wet bulb globe temperature index, reaches at least 26 degrees. That is a technical term, but the idea is simple. This index does not just measure air temperature, it measures humidity, sun exposure, and wind speed together. It measures at its core how hard your body has to work to cool itself down. At 26 degrees on that index, the Global Players Union, FIFPro, recommends mandatory hydration breaks because the risk of heat stress is real and well documented. 5 matches are projected to exceed 28 degrees. At that level, FIFPro recommends outright considering postponement. We are talking about the risk of heat stroke, a condition that kills. The final on July 19th at MetLife has a 1 in 8 chance of reaching that 26-degree threshold, and a 2.7% chance of hitting the postponement threshold of 28. MetLife has no roof, it has no air conditioning, and it is going to hold 80,000 people on a Sunday afternoon in July in New Jersey. One important distinction that is worth making here. Players have team doctors, physiotherapists, cooling vests, cold water at their feet, and real-time medical monitoring. The fan who paid $15,500 for a seat in row 47 on the south side of the stadium has none of that. One of the lead scientists on the study, Frederic Otto, put it clearly. It is dangerous for the players, yes, but it is also dangerous for the fans who are sitting outside with no medical team looking after them. Only 3 of the 16 stadiums have climate control: Dallas, Houston, and Atlanta. 13 do not. A study by the University of Toronto, published last year and based on 2 decades of weather data, concluded that 14 of the 16 host cities will experience conditions exceeding safety thresholds for playing soccer at some point during June or July. 14 out of 16. And when ESPN asked FIFA directly whether they would consider reassigning matches to enclosed stadiums, FIFA's response was silence. Then there is the question of who can actually enter the country, a story that the press tends to cover as a political issue, but is really, fundamentally, a soccer story. Active travel restrictions currently affect nationals from 39 countries. A travel bond program requiring financial guarantees of up to $15,000 was announced, with a partial exemption for ticketed fans from 5 specific countries, just 16 days before the tournament begins. 16 days. The ACLU, Amnesty International, and more than 120 organizations issued a formal travel warning for international visitors. 4 qualified nations have fans who are directly affected by total or partial entry bans: Côte d'Ivoire, Haiti, Senegal, and Iran. The Iran situation deserves its own moment. FIFA's Secretary General had to fly to Istanbul just yesterday to meet with the Iranian Football Federation in person and give them guarantees that their players would be allowed to enter the United States. Iran confirmed its participation last night. That is good news. But the fact that that meeting needed to happen at all tells you a great deal about how the last several months have been managed. There is also the matter of what this all looks like from a broader sporting context. The 2026 World Cup was supposed to represent something specific, a statement that soccer had finally arrived in the United States, not as a niche sport for immigrants and suburbanites, but as a mainstream American passion. The expansion to 48 teams was sold as a gift to the game's smaller nations, a chance for more countries to experience a World Cup, more stories, more upsets, more magic. And there is real potential in all of that. The on-field product, once the tournament begins, has every reason to be spectacular. But the off-field machinery surrounding it has produced something that feels very different from the vision that was pitched. Consider the halftime show announcement. This is the first time in World Cup history that a halftime entertainment act has been added to the final. The Super Bowl has done it for decades, and the Super Bowl's halftime show has become an institution of American sports culture. But the Super Bowl is, at its core, a domestic event. The World Cup final is something else entirely. It is the most watched sporting event on the planet. It does not need a halftime show. It has never needed one. Adding one suggests, at some level, a recognition that the product alone may not be landing the way it was supposed to. Or perhaps it is simply FIFA leaning into the American entertainment market it chose to play in. Either way, putting Madonna and Shakira at the break of the championship match of global soccer is a cultural statement, whether it was intended as one or not. And the dynamic pricing experiment deserves a harder look beyond just the numbers. Dynamic pricing is not inherently evil. Airlines use it, hotels use it, concert promoters use it, but all of those industries are selling products that are fundamentally substitutable. If a flight to Miami is too expensive, you can drive. If a Taylor Swift ticket is out of reach, you can watch on TV. The World Cup is not substitutable. For a fan from Mexico, from Argentina, from Senegal, attending their national team's World Cup match is not a leisure purchase. It is a once-in-a-generation experience with deep cultural and emotional weight. Applying the logic of entertainment market pricing to that kind of attachment is not just commercially risky. It is a statement about whose experience the tournament is being organized around. The data from the secondary market now strongly suggests that FIFA misjudged the price elasticity of that attachment. Fans care deeply, but they are not infinitely willing to pay. And when prices are set too high, the signal that goes out to everyone else is, this event is not for you. Once that signal is out, it is almost impossible to take back. What is particularly striking about the current situation is that the problems were not unforeseeable. The climate risks were documented months ago. The visa barriers have been in place and publicly reported for the better part of a year. The concerns about dynamic pricing were raised loudly and formally by fan organizations, by Congress members, by European regulatory bodies. The hotel room block cancellation was a deliberate decision made in March. At each point, there were people raising alarms. At each point, the machinery kept moving in the same direction. That is not a story of bad luck. That is a story of choices. And yet, and this needs to be said clearly, the tournament itself is still coming. When Lionel Messi steps onto the field in what will likely be his 6th and final World Cup, the cameras will find him and the planet will stop. When Cristiano Ronaldo lines up for Portugal at 41 years old, his presence alone will carry a symbolic weight that no ticket price can manufacture. Mbappe, Haaland, Bellingham, Vinicius, the talent assembled across these 48 squads is genuinely extraordinary. The knockout rounds are going to be brutal and beautiful in the way they always are. The group stage will produce upsets and moments of pure wonder. The Azteca on June 11th for the opening match is going to remind the whole world why it fell in love with this tournament in the first place. The Canadian host cities will welcome the world with authentic warmth. And the final, whatever else is happening around it, will be watched by more than 1 billion people. That is not going to change. But here is the honest summary. The 2026 World Cup was promised as one thing and is arriving as something considerably different. The promise was a tournament that belonged to the world. Accessible, festive, a celebration of soccer's universal reach, hosted on a continent ready to welcome everyone. The reality is a tournament whose hotels are calling it a non-event, where ticket prices are in free fall because demand never showed up, where climate scientists are warning about conditions that may require postponements, where the players' union is demanding an urgent review of safety protocols, where a qualified national team only confirmed its participation after an emergency meeting, and where, for the first time in history, a halftime entertainment show has been added to the final, because apparently, at some level, soccer needed backup from Madonna and Shakira. That is not quite what Infantino was describing when he talked about 1,000 years of World Cups. And still, the ball is going to start rolling. Soccer has a way of imposing its own truth once that happens. It has rescued worse organized tournaments from their own noise before. It will probably do it again. The sport is bigger than the apparatus around it, and it tends to remind us of that at the most inconvenient moments for the people running the apparatus. But for FIFA, for the organization that made these choices, that selected dynamic pricing, that canceled those hotel room blocks in March, that laughed about a $2 million ticket in Beverly Hills, the 2026 World Cup is going to stand as a case study. A case study in what happens when you treat the most beloved sporting event in the world primarily as a commercial opportunity. What happens when a tournament stops being about the fans and starts being about the revenue targets. And maybe, if we are being fully honest, it is also a case study in what happens when fans absorb decision after decision, year after year, without pushing back loudly enough. Until one day the numbers hit the market and the market tells the truth that no press conference was going to deliver. The slow erosion of accessibility, the gradual redefinition of what a World Cup is for, the moment when the thing you defended turns out to look nothing like the thing you learned to love. The question that this tournament leaves hanging is not really about logistics or prices or heat indexes. It is a bigger one. Does the World Cup still belong to the world? And if the answer to that question is becoming more complicated than it used to be, then perhaps the most important conversation in soccer right now is not happening inside a stadium. It is happening everywhere else.